Good evening and welcome to Guardians of Gaia with myself, Megan Edwards, right here on Cape Town TV, Channel 263. In tonight's topic, we look at the relationship Eskom and Koeberg have had with nuclear energy and the impact that nuclear waste has had on the environment. If you've just joined, you've walked into South Africa's only environmental show that focuses primarily on solutions and alternatives to the climate change crisis. We explore ways in which communities are trying to save their planet for themselves, each in their own way. Tonight's episode is part one of a two-part special where we look at South Africa's energy crisis. Now, of course, energy is a huge part of the climate change crisis, as our energy all around the world is mostly sourced unsustainably, from fossil fuels to nuclear energy. However, we do need energy to drive our cars and fuel our machines. Now, one term most South Africans are very familiar with, of course, is load shedding, but very few of us actually understand where electricity comes from, why we have load shedding, and what the future of electricity actually looks like in this country. So we get our hands dirty as we consider the costs, the health risks, community safety, and politics involved with South Africa's electricity and energy crisis. I'm Megan Edwards, and this is Guardians of Gaia.
The South African energy crisis. It is defined as an ongoing period where the country experiences widespread blackouts as supply falls behind demand. Having begun in 2007, what we've come to know as load shedding continues to this day.
A lot of people are concerned about load shedding at the moment, and what we've got is a situation where very poor planning has led to a capacity shortage, and that means maintenance hasn't been done on other plants and various other things that needed to be done to keep those plants operational. So Eskom have announced that in the next 2 or 3 years there's going to be crunch time. We're going to be short of power, we're going to be load shedding. So in those same 2 or 3 years, the people who run Koeberg want to refurbish it to allow it to run for another 20 years, which means they're going to have to shut it down, which means we're going to have more load shedding. So it's really not a rational choice to try and keep Koeberg running beyond 2024. What we should do is let it run, get all the power we can out of it up to 2024, not shut it down and replace generators and try and refurbish the thing. And by 2024, we're going to have wind farms and solar PV and who knows what else by that time, maybe battery, maybe hydro storage and so on. So that would be what we would advocate for Koeberg.
While Eskom contributes towards 42% of South Africa's total greenhouse emissions, it generates 95% of the electricity used in South Africa and about half of the electricity used on the African continent. Of all the electricity that Eskom does generate, less than 4% comes from Koeberg Nuclear Station, and the rest from a variety of coal burning stations. Load shedding is implemented whenever generating units are taken offline for maintenance, repairs, and refueling.
So Koeberg was built in the 1970s and came online in the 1980s, and Eskom, by law, is the only entity that can generate and distribute electricity. So Eskom ended up operating the Koeberg plant, because I think a lot of times people have the wrong impression of that. So if we look at what's called nominal capacity, which is the ability of each power station, if it was working, to produce power, Koeberg is responsible for 3.6% of the national capacity. So that is quite low. And if you look at what's called a reserve margin, and that is the amount of excess electricity that a country should have to cater for a shutdown or an unexpected situation, that's considered 15% is a healthy margin. So if you look at the 3.6 of Koeberg, that is really insignificant in that big picture. And the only reason Koeberg is needed at all is through the bad planning of Eskom, which means that we're so close and we have a reserve margin of basically zero and sometimes negative. And when the reserve margin is negative, we call that load shedding.
There are both advantages and disadvantages to nuclear energy.
I think it's good to remember that all energy has some advantages and disadvantages. I mean, coal is now seen as being the real bad boy of energy because of the pollution and the effect on climate change. Pollution, I certainly wouldn't want to live out in Mpumalanga next to one of those coal power stations. On the other hand, I would much rather live next to Koeberg. On the other hand, coal, we've got to remember, was and is still fairly cheap if you look at the old power stations. And unfortunately, people in South Africa are not rich. You know, there are a few people who would say, well, I will pay extra for energy as long as it's not, doesn't cause CO2 and so on. But in general, with the inequalities that we've got to try and make sure that energy is cheap. It's no good if we come up with a clean energy, but it's 4 or 5 times the price of what coal is. So coal, fortunately or unfortunately, will still continue to be a basic fuel in South Africa. Nuclear, worldwide, there's really, in the Western world, there's a move away from nuclear. On the other hand, in India and China, they are still building nuclear plants, and they think that this is a reasonable way to go. That's too complicated a thing to build. A new nuclear plant is extremely expensive. You also have to pay a lot of money up front, and that's as opposed to some other energy systems.
So if I'm asked about the advantages of nuclear, we have to go back to the motivation for creating the nuclear plant. So the advantage is you can make nuclear weapons. If you want to think of that as an advantage, is kind of questionable. Some people also say that nuclear power is low carbon, and some people lie and say it's zero carbon. So it's certainly not a zero carbon, because we need to look at the entire fuel chain. You need to mine the uranium, you need to transport that. At the moment, we mine uranium here, we ship it overseas, there it's fabricated into fuel, that's shipped back. All of this is using diesel and emitting a large amount of carbon. Then it goes into the plant. Once it's in the plant, the amount of pollutants that are produced are much smaller than something like coal. Of course, bigger than something like wind or solar, but much better than something like coal. The problem is, once that fuel has been used up, something has to happen to it. And it's very, very, very dangerous stuff. The plutonium stays dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. So nowhere in the world have they yet worked out what to do with that spent fuel once it comes out of the reactor. So that process also will take building, construction, concrete, which produces carbon dioxide, construction vehicles, diesel, and so on. So we don't know the carbon footprint of fuel disposal yet, because we haven't done it anywhere in the world.
No action was taken by government to expand the country's energy production capacity before 2007, as government was considering the privatization of Eskom.